So after a tumultuous first season under Josh McDaniels that ended in a little bit of controversy at quarterback, they entered into a new direction under center for the first time in nearly 10 years. And why do I say a little bit of controversy? Well, in the last 2 games of the 2022 regular season, the Las Vegas Raiders decided to bench their longtime quarterback, Derek Carr, for the last 2 games because they were trying to trade him in the offseason. But when that didn't come to fruition, they removed the keys out of Derek Carr and decided to release him. And when they released him, looks like they didn't really have a plan for which quarterback to go after, because a month later, came in to replace him was Jimmy Garoppolo. Yes, Jimmy Garoppolo from the San Francisco 49ers. So what became the Niners' problem was about to become the Raiders' problem. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, well, injury prone, very conservative on offense, dink and dunk quarterback, check down artists, happy feet in the pocket, you name it. A lot of problems that we had to suffer. I mean, some people like to say, "Oh, he's a winning quarterback. He won the Niners X amount of games." When in reality, once we get further into talking about the Raiders season, you soon realize maybe it wasn't Jimmy G. Well, at least not most of it was about Jimmy G. So, considering the fact that the Jimmy G era was already off to a fascinating start, he had shoulder surgery that the Raiders didn't even account for, and he didn't participate in most of the offseason stuff, all because of it. So, either way, it was going to be a very fun season for the Silver and Black in Vegas, and I'm not even sure what if any of the Raider Nation was like happy for it. Like, were they even like ready for what was to come with the Jimmy G era in Las Vegas? So obviously, when you look at what went wrong for the Raiders this past season, you look at the start to the season. I mean, of course, like I said, with Jimmy G under center and on offense, you had a lot of offensive ineptitude, as I like to say it. I mean, it wasn't any different when Derek Carr was under center with Jimmy Garoppolo, but actually, it was a little bit worse. They were still a check down merchant team. You know, Derek Carr, not a very aggressive quarterback, and neither was Jimmy G. You know, this is post ACL Jimmy G we're talking about here. That heavily relies on plays after the catch. Turnovers were higher than ever. You didn't have as reliable of an offensive line. I mean, he didn't have as reliable of an offensive line like he did in his last year in San Francisco, but his offensive line was much worse. But anyway, Jimmy G in the games that he played was responsible for most of them, for the turnovers we're talking about here, and he led the league in interceptions in the 8 games that he played, throwing at least 1 each game he played. And he also missed 2 games with the concussion. I mean, injuries do suck. And his replacements were not that much better. Brian Hoyer in that 1 game against Chicago was absolutely terrible. And Aiden O'Connell in both as a fill-in starter as against the Chargers, and later a permanent role much later on in the season. He did decent, but I don't think he did enough to establish himself as a long-term option. And then, of course, you had those first 8 games under Josh McDaniels. Alongside Jimmy G, the Raiders head coach in McDaniels, man, it was just a mess. The over-reliance of running back Josh Jacobs, and you try to get Davante Adams involved, but in actuality, they didn't. They relied more so in favor of Jacoby Myers as the number 1 guy. I mean, it's not bad per se, but when you have a talent like Davante Adams, it's just like, you got to feed him the ball. You got to have that balancing act of, you know, Davante and Myers. It's like, isn't that what you trade him for? So, yeah, like, Davante Adams was like kind of a disappearing act. You saw a lot of frustration out of that because, well, they're not feeding him the ball. So, it's like, what are they doing? So anyway, Josh McDaniels also didn't make a lot of adjustments in the games that the Raiders were trailing in. So it's like the more they lost these games that the Raiders were in, the more disconnected the players became from their head coach. Even as so far to publicly question McDaniels. This was like another running theme that McDaniels ran into when he was the head coach in Denver. And that boiling point finally reached right after the Lions game in week 8 on that Monday nighter. Mark Daniels fired Josh McDaniels after everyone lashed out at him during a team meeting. Ouch. That's not a good way to go out. And especially considering that, yeah, the players are basically telling you that we hate you. We hate you, McDaniels. So they decided to fire Josh McDaniels, and Mark Davis decided to name Antonio Pierce as the interim head coach. And also forgot to mention that they also fired general manager Dave Ziegler as well, because, that's the GM that Josh McDaniels brought in. So anyway, once they decided to name Antonio Pierce the interim head coach, you saw a noticeable difference in how this team played and reacted among each other. There's a sense of unity. There's a sense of camaraderie within this team. They started to play a lot harder with each other and for their head coach. And as a result, they were a lot closer in these games the rest of the way, even whether they won or lost. So regardless of the final score, they had renewed effort. They played a lot tougher. They played a lot harder. The Raiders went 5-4 the rest of the way. Sure, they had a losing record, but they finished with a winning division record, and that included an upset win over the Kansas City Chiefs, who did win the Super Bowl. But for the Raiders, we're not a playoff team by means, but they were almost there, and they got a major upset win, at least in their season, which was good for them. And a lot of that has to do with an improved defense down the stretch, because obviously you have edge rusher Max Crosby, who was a near unstoppable force in the front four. But then you look at the emergence of defensive tackle Byron Young, and then middle linebacker Robert Spillane. They made a push over defense early in the season into a bend, don't break one that limited opponents to 20 points or less. So they weren't giving up a lot of points, except with a couple exceptions, but they were creating havoc within their side of the ball. And yeah, the offense was still a very mixed bag with Aiden O'Connell, but again, that defense really turned it around with the change into Antonio Pierce. But there were some positives on the offensive side of the ball, like the newfound bounce at running back, because of course they placed heavy emphasis on that with running back Josh Jacobs. But then once he went down with injury in the last 4 games of the season, they decided to turn it to Zamir White, who had himself a good last 4 games while Jacobs was out. And you look at it, it's like maybe you have a 2-headed bounce attack in the future to take some pressure off of Josh Jacobs and a guy like Zamir White. So maybe they got something in here. So yeah, the Raiders didn't have a great start because of the coaching with McDaniels and the play of Jimmy G expectedly backfiring on them. But they did turn it around once Mark Davis dumped McDaniels and gave the interim keys to Antonio Pierce. And they ended up with an 8-9 record with a 5-4 finish. So yeah, it may have been a losing record, but at least Mark Davis finally has a competent head coach to run things after the disasters of John Gruden and Josh McDaniels. So at least Davis, after listening to the players and then going through several candidates, he rewarded Pierce with the permanent coaching job. And then he hired former Chargers general manager Tom Telesco as his new GM, which ironically, in that game, that 60-point, not the 60-point win, it was like a 50-point, 40-point win over the Chargers on that Thursday night. But the point is, it's like after beating the Chargers up so bad at home that he inadvertently cost him his job, he brings him in. Kind of ironic, don't you think? But anyway, now that the offseason is in full swing, now it was kind of interesting. You had to make some tough decisions with the silver and black as they were kind of going through this potential period of change, like an actual period of change. So entering this offseason, like they started out with $47 million. I'm not sure what the actual number is now, considering how much they spent now. So they do have a first round pick, at number 13th. So it's just kind of not a bad place to be in. Some of your key free agents entering the period before free agency opened was tackle Jermaine Ellimore on the offensive line, guard Andre James, and then running back Josh Jacobs, which was the key guy that the Raiders were going to try to re-sign. So looking at some of the moves that they already made, they do plan on releasing Jimmy Garoppolo, who is going to be suspended the next 2 games of the season for violating the NFL's performance-enhancing drug policy. So it looks like they are moving on from Jimmy G, considering they did sign Gardner Minshew from the Indianapolis Colts. Defensively, though, they addressed one of their team needs that they needed in the offseason, which was defensive tackle Christian Wilkins from the Miami Dolphins. They gave him a big, fat contract. Whether that contract will be worth it remains to be seen, but they addressed one of their key issues in the defensive line, which was, the interior pass rush. So they get some major help there to go alongside Byron Young and Max Crosby. Unfortunately, though, they are losing Josh Jacobs to the Green Bay Packers, so he signed over there. So actually, this is a good way to go into what else they need to address in this offseason. So they got to find a replacement for Josh Jacobs. Obviously, it was going to be a tough decision whether to keep him or delete him, because he did miss a couple of games. He was up and down sometimes, but now they got to find a replacement for him. Because Zamir White did have good 4 games because, well, let's face it, 4 games, it's a little bit of a small sample size for a running back who it looks like he's going to be penciled in to start. And then obviously you got to find a starting quarterback. I mean, obviously Jimmy G is going to be gone. I don't believe Aiden O'Connell is going to be a long-term answer under center. I mean, does have an opportunity to compete for the starting job in training camp, but I don't think it's gonna be a long-term fix. They also did sign Gardner Minshew, but ideally, you want to look into the draft for that next franchise guy if there's something available. Though that's the thing. And then last but not least, you got to address both sides of the trenches. I mean, offensively, you had below average pass protection within the offensive line, especially at right tackle. So you got to look into upgrading both spots, both the right tackle and the guard spots. So you got to fix the interior and that right tackle spot. Defensively, you did fix some of the interior pass rush with Christian Wilkins, but now you got to beef it up, adding some depth behind him. So the Las Vegas Raiders in 2023, didn't get off to a right foot, but it ended with promise. But obviously now you have some questions regarding the future heading towards 2024. And while it looks like Antonio Pierce looks like a coach that can really get the best out of his team, as evidenced with his interim tenure, now that he's full-time, now that he kind of has a feel for who he wants to go with this team, he still has to answer that big question. Who's this quarterback going to be for 2024 and potentially beyond?